And we're excited to have the senior curator from the Detroit Historic Society again, Joel Stone. And he was here, how long ago were you here? You talking about Alfred Kahn last, about 6 months ago? April? Okay. Wow. Time flies when you're having fun. Okay. And he's going to be speaking about Detroit during the 1920s when the auto industry was booming, as Prohibition created a whole new industry within the city. And please help me in welcoming Joel Stone.
Thank you very much, and an absolute pleasure to be here. It's always nice to when organizations work together and get the word out about these things. Last time I was here, I was talking about Albert Kahn. Frankly, I was mentioning earlier, I'm a boat guy, although I know what Oshkosh means. Okay. I get that, okay? But I'm a boat guy, so coming out here to this facility and talking about planes and Albert Kahn was rather stunning. It was a little imposing. It's nice to be able to talk about this. This is one of my favorite presentations. It's fortunate in that one of my cohorts, who's actually one of your Rosies, had to cancel tonight. So she turned this one over to me, and it's one of the ones that I really like doing, enjoy talking about this. The commercial is real quick. I work for the Detroit Historical Society. We run 2 museums. Both museums are free. There's information over on the side table there. It's the brochures that we just dropped a new brochure this week. So these are out of date, but they'll give you all the information and the kind of stuff that we do at the Detroit Historical Society, besides come out and talk. And that is one of the best parts of my job. I get to go out to all the great libraries around southeastern Michigan. I actually was up at a retirement center this afternoon talking to people who the age was about 88 to 104. And I'm talking about the arsenal of democracy. These people lived it, and I'm talking about it. It was real interesting getting their feedback. That's the kind of stuff that's, in fact, I got goosebumps. It's cool. Talking about the 20s? No, talking about us. That's us, DetroitHistorical.org. Talking about the 1920s is just the best of times, the worst of times, to steal from Dickens. It was when the auto business was absolutely taking off. It had built itself in the 1900s, 1910s, and it just absolutely sparked itself. And then for some reason we outlawed alcohol, and that really made things exciting. So that's what I'm going to talk about as we go through this. Wonderful time in Detroit. I always start by pointing out where Detroit is for those who, how many grew up southeastern Michigan? All right, that makes life a whole lot easier. It was about 30% this afternoon. So we've been around doing this for a while. We have evidence of human habitation going back thousands of years, certainly settlements in this area going back 1,000 years. In fact, I drive by the Indian Mound at Fort Wayne every day. And then we've been trading, we've been developing a strategy as a strategic spot, developing the mechanisms that made Detroit great here, and being a big part of this wonderful freshwater system. As a boat guy, I can't stress enough how important this is, and we got to keep paying attention to that. So this is Detroit kind of growing out of the Civil War era from 1900 to the First World War. And just, if you don't mind me shouting a little bit, and I'm going to make it tough on you, I'm really sorry. This is the original area where Detroit was. And the area stretching up here were ribbon farms, French ribbon farms that were eventually incorporated into the city over 100 years. But by the time we got to the end of the First World War, Detroit had only expanded this much. The yellow area toward the top is the Boston Edison district, for those of you who know Detroit. The green area that wraps around there is kind of Grand Boulevard, just to give you an idea, and a little bit to the east into Hamtramck Township. We had also bought Belle Isle, so that's as big as Detroit was by the time that the First World War was over. And in the next 7 years, this is what Detroit did. Wow, wait a minute. All right, let's back up a bit. This is where we were just after the Civil War. We finally in 1870 got a new city hall. It was the tallest thing in town. Absolutely. Pictures taken from the top of that showed nothing that was anywhere near as tall as that. And you can tell by the buildings, they're basically old Federalist buildings. And Detroit was a growing town, a town that had an incredible knack for capturing industries. And we forget about the car, when we talk about the car business in Detroit and Motown, we forget that before that we had so many other industries here that allowed us to make the cars eventually. You know, we started with the steel. There was the Bessemer steel, well, it wasn't Bessemer, it was more Kelly steel, but pneumatic steel. It was blown by Eber Ward down in Wyandotte. Because we started at the first steel in the United States. While we started doing that, we started making railroad cars. And most people, when we talk cars, don't think of Detroit as making more rolling stock than any other city in the country. Pullman, when Pullman got started, he bought a company in Detroit and started here before he moved to Indiana. We were also good at making iron, more stoves than any place else in the world. We were good at brass and copper because, of course, we're halfway between the steel mills and the coal that's down in Pennsylvania and Ohio and the ore deposits that are up north. Everything is coming to us, and we worked with it. We made more ships than any place else on the Great Lakes. This is what we did. We also had other businesses. Besides passenger shipping, we made ships. We had passenger shipping based out of here. Adding machines, Burroughs, was started in St. Louis, came to Detroit because it was the least unionized town in the country. I'm just saying, okay? And it wasn't until the 1930s that Detroit did get unionized, and that was an important part of the Arsenal story, but not an important part of this story here. We had that. We had vacuum cleaners. We made all kinds of things, scales. The scales you used to see when you'd walk into the butcher shop and they'd put the meat on the thing and the little rolly would go around. Automatic calculators were started here in Detroit. We just had these skills at our fingertips. We also, and this is just kind of an aside, we published more sheet music than any place else in the country until Irving Berlin took the business in 1935. The Remick Company had guys like Harry Warren and George Gershwin on their staff in Tin Pan Alley, writing songs for us. And I don't know, anybody out there sing barbershop? Man, these are the songs that I grew up with. 1900, these were the Who, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and it was all based out of Detroit. If you're over on Belle Isle and you see the Remick band shell, that was donated by the guys who did this. So, quick aside. But we also did all kinds of things like pharmaceuticals, leathers, of course. We have been into fur and leather since the beginning, and curiously, as of a couple of years ago, MDOT reported that Detroit was still the major entry point for furs in North America. So while we started with furs, we're still in the fur business. The Ferry Seed Company obviously didn't invent seeds or gardens, but they did invent the little packets that you could walk into a dime store and buy just the right amount of anything you want with great pictures on the cover. The marketing that went along with that was tremendous. And then, of course, we got into gasoline engines pretty darn early. Since in Grand Rapids, went to the Chicago Fair, and a bunch of Detroit guys saw his stuff and started picking it up and practicing with it in boats, frankly. They did it in boats, which is why we got into the speedboat business. Chris Craft, Sea Ray, Leggett, Garwood, all of those fast speedboats were based out of Detroit before moving to Florida eventually. But we knew how to make gas engines, and we knew how to make boats go fast, which came in really handy when Prohibition came along. So we also had the world's busiest waterway. Detroit River carried more tonnage in 1907 than the ports of New York and the port of London put together. So not all of it stopped here. A lot of it was on its way to Cleveland and Lorraine, but it carried. I mean, we had the busiest waterway in the world. And people kind of forget about this. This is the Belle Isle Lighthouse, which is where the Coast Guard station sits today. Boats had passed by that lighthouse every couple of minutes back in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. Because of the lumber money that we had here, and eventually the steel money and the manufacturing money, we had some beautiful houses. This is Cass Avenue. And when I was growing up, Cass was a place you didn't go. Right now, Cass is a place you go if you're kind of hip and you got a funny hat. And it's all of a sudden a boutique place where it used to be a place you absolutely avoided. But back in the day, Cass was the place to be. And by the time we got to the turn of the century, there was a building, a federal building, you can see it in the background, that finally topped out the city hall. We finally were starting to build a city based on the manufacturing might that we had. I mentioned we purchased Belle Isle. Many other cities around the Great Lakes have great waterfronts. Chicago, Milwaukee, Cleveland, they all have wonderful waterfront parks. We didn't have that ability because, as I'll show you in a few minutes, by the 1870s, our waterfront on the river was completely absorbed by industry. Foundries, large and small, chemical plants, anything you needed to make what was necessary was based along the Detroit River. We were certainly a town that was built by the river, built along the river, but built because of the river. This is where you went for entertainment. And you could do this. I mentioned the steamboats. You could get on a boat, any one of a dozen boats any day, and you could go for a long trip. You could go to Duluth, you could go to Chicago, you could go over to Niagara Falls. That would have been the boat on the right. The boat on the left, the Tajmu, headed up the St. Clair River, stopping at, dozens of nice little places. In fact, I think I've got a picture. There's Joe Bador's. Joe Bador's was one of 24 little resorts you could go up. And you could go up and spend the day, go fishing, go hunting. You could spend the week. This was up north. Okay, they didn't. There weren't any roads. This was up north, and that's the way you could do it. There was also the Awana in this picture, and the Awana went south. It went to Cedar Point. Even back in this day, Cedar Point was a place you went for entertainment. Of course, we all know Boblo, Sugar Island. Those places were all available for people to go for entertainment. And then days before air conditioning, you pay 50 cents, 75 cents for an all-day excursion. You're out there traveling over the water at 20 knots. Good breeze coming over, good food, probably good beer. It was a good way to spend a day, and people had the wherewithal to do that. This is the old Park Davis plant. I throw this in just to show the smokestacks. While things were wonderful and people were making money, and in fact we had a big migration of not just the Western European immigrants that were used to, the Irish, the Germans, but the Eastern immigrants started coming in through this period to get the great jobs. It was a wonderful place to really establish a middle class. It was happening, but it was a dirty town. I mean, all of the foundries and all of the homes and all of the businesses were either burning coal or wood, and that's, made for a busy and dirty town. So we got up to this was actually 1900, and this builds out. Now we're to the end of the First World War. This is 1918. We pushed a little bit north into Grosse Pointe Township. We pushed a little bit south, kind of toward the Dearborn area and the Solvay plants down in Delray. But that's pretty much where we were by the end of the First World War. And this is what happens in the next 7 years. This is where I thought I was 5 minutes ago. So that's what we did. In that short a time, we built out, and the only things we didn't get were kind of in the middle there. The Hamtramck and Highland Park, which got set up. Henry Ford essentially set up Highland Park as kind of his own little place to do business, and Hamtramck picked up on that, and they set themselves aside too to do that also. But it made for a huge city, 138 square miles. There are very few towns. Philadelphia is about that same size, but there are very few other cities that are that large. In fact, if you took Manhattan, Boston, and I think Baltimore, you could just pick them up and drop them right in to Detroit without touching the edges. So huge town. It was a wonderful thing. Then we were building more homes. If we look, I think I've got some numbers here. You can see that in 1900 we had 300,000 people, and it quadrupled in the next 30 years. I'm sorry, quintupled in the next 30 years. Just absolutely. And the region did that too. It wasn't just within the city limits. Of course, the Birminghams, the areas downriver were growing. Lots of little towns were getting started. Detroit was really growing fast, more single-family homes per capita than any place else. The infrastructure that was necessary to support all of that was going in the 1910s and the 1920s, and Detroit really was absolutely booming. You know, some of the buildings, in fact, I'll run through these, but some of the buildings that we consider our iconic buildings all came up during this time. Here's a picture, I think 1910. Yeah. So here's the skyline in 1910, because the Ford building is the tallest building there. That was opened in 1909, and you can see the ferries and the boats on the waterfront. And 20 years later, this is what we got. Okay, all of those buildings popped up during this period. Everybody trying to build the next tallest building. You know, right now Gilbert's got no competition. He's going to build a tall building, and it's going to beat a building that was built 40 years ago, 50 years ago. These buildings were all going up at the very same time, and it was pretty incredible. I mean, 1915, we were still kind of a rough town. The streets hadn't really been paved, but you can see the Majestic building in the background. There's the Ford and the Dime building, the hotel, Pontchartrain Hotel off to the side, the first one of those. But we've still got horses running with trolleys, running with cars. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This is 1910, 1900. This is Cadillac Square. And Cadillac Square leads up to Campus Martius. And this has always kind of been a gathering place for Detroit. So what we've got here is a park in 1910. All right, cars 10, 12 years old. And you just go a few years after that, and the park has become parking. Detroiters embraced the automobile. We liked cars from the very beginning, and Henry Ford made them affordable. And because he did, everybody else had to kind of bring their prices down, and we just made it easy to do it. I threw another picture in here too. This picture was taken 3 or 4 years ago, and now the park is part park and part parking. So we've kind of balanced that out. But the big buildings, I mean, this is the largest Masonic temple in the world. 43 orders originally were housed there, with a couple of cathedrals and 3 auditoriums and 2 ballrooms and a swimming pool that never actually ever got water put into it. And then, you know, drill spaces, just an incredibly beautiful and huge building. If you ever get a chance to do a tour of this building, it takes about 4 or 5 hours. So put on your walking shoes. But there's the Michigan Central Station was built during this time. Of course, the DIA right across the street, the public library. Some of our most beautiful buildings were built at this point. The Fisher Building, the Penobscot Building, all of those were going up. I threw this picture in just to show that this is what a drugstore looked like. Okay, things were gorgeous in Detroit. CVS, they're not going to do this. Okay, this is an absolutely gorgeous building that was a drugstore. People were proud of the storefronts that they were doing. And we got to remember that Detroit was a city of storefronts. One after another, up and down Mack, up and down Gratiot, up and down Grand River, with people having their own individual businesses and either renting the space upstairs out or living upstairs themselves. That was very, very common, and as they could afford to, then they would actually buy a house in a neighborhood that was all houses. If you get over on the east side of Detroit near City Airport, and you guys are airport guys, so I can imagine you've been over there, the streets run fairly silly because of the old French ribbon farms, but you'll also see that the neighborhoods used to be, oddly enough, a bar and a couple of houses and a church and a tool and die shop and another bar and a grocery store. And you know, it wasn't all a street of houses. Detroit was a very mixed bag when it came to that. And it wasn't until the 20s that we really started to find those neighborhoods that were built out for blocks as just houses with maybe a grocery store on a corner. So that was kind of a real transitional period in Detroit. It was also when we installed a bridge, we installed a tunnel, pretty major infrastructure additions. Detroit was flying high right up until 1929. And of course, Henry Ford is building his mega plant. He and Albert Kahn had figured it out at Highland Park, and then they took it down to the Rouge, and they started building it out and created the largest manufacturing facility of its kind in the world. And I mentioned the riverfront. Here's a picture. You can see the ships are all lined up, and those first 3 blocks up to Jefferson are nothing but shops. Large shops, small shops, they're making elevators, they're making bricks, they're making all kinds of stuff down there. It was a working waterfront, which is why we picked up Belle Isle in the background there. And if you go downriver, it was all railroads. I mean, there were railroads on the east side, but the biggest yards were on the west side, and we had the rail car ferries that were crossing back and forth to Canada every 30 minutes. 18, 24 rail cars year-round, around the clock. This was a busy, working waterfront, serious international seaport, which we tend to forget when we talk about Detroit. We also had some incredible music. Okay, this is the Gene Goldkett Orchestra, but Gene Goldkett was a guy, dubious beginnings, came over from Europe and I think left whatever his history was behind, but a very talented musician and conductor, but also a very talented organizer. He would often run 4 or 5 bands around the country at any given time. He also was the head of the RCA Recording Orchestra. And if you look at the names across the bottom there, I don't know if you can all see them, but there's Joe Venuti, Bix Beiderbecke, Frank Trumbauer, and Mez Mesro, both the Dorsey brothers, Russ Morgan, Pee Wee Hunt. These are the names that became the huge names in the 40s, that became the big band stalwarts. Were playing in the bands that toured for Gene Goldkett. One of the other bands that he toured, and he actually had a couple of these, but this was the big one, McKinney's Cotton Pickers. And the McKinney family's still in Detroit playing music, but these guys were very popular on the East Coast circuit and traveling down south. They had a bit more trouble, but the Doc Cheathams, the Coleman Hawkins, the Lonnie Johnsons, the James P. Johnsons, Roy Eldridge, Don Redman. These are the bands where the guys who were going to be the great jazz players later were cutting their teeth. So this is all based out of Detroit, and things were happening. We had, during the period, all of our wonderful hotels were going up, and there was a good reason for that. We had booze. People brought parties to Detroit. Conventions came to Detroit. Musicians could work. Musicians had lots of places to work. Clubs, hotels. The steamships all had bands. Being a musician in Detroit was actually a way to make a living. That kind of changed in the past probably 30 or 40 years. Then we get to Sin City. This is where it gets fun. So there was no Las Vegas, all right? There was New Orleans, and New Orleans has always been New Orleans. But when it came to the place you wanted to go if you really wanted to get serious, Detroit was the place. And this is in our DNA. We've got, if you travel from Port Huron down to the foot of the Detroit River, about 90 miles, most of it is less than a mile wide. There in Lake St. Clair, it gets to about 20 miles wide, but that means it's dark and abandoned, which is actually a good thing if you're trying to smuggle, right? We've been smuggling for a long time. In fact, Cadillac kind of started it. Cadillac, of course, the founder of Detroit, was only here for 9 years before he got fired because he was smuggling furs back into France, not paying the duties. All right, duties go to the king, who was his boss. That didn't go over well. He got promoted to be the governor of Louisiana, which is like being promoted to Siberia. He didn't stay very long. He didn't like it. He even knew he was going to get arrested when he went back to Paris, and he did get arrested, got put in jail for a couple of years, and had enough money left over that he was able to buy a mayorship in a small town, and that's how he kind of retired. But smuggling was, and actually if you study European history, Germans, English, French, Dutch, they loved smuggling. It was a sport. They didn't have NFL. They smuggled, okay? So this was all part of them when they came. And the French came, and then the English came, and eventually the Americans. And, of course, probably one of our biggest products was the smuggling of humans, getting people across the border into Canada, well, initially into the United States. Initially, with the Northwest Ordinance, slavery was outlawed in Michigan, but it was not in Ontario, and there are several very large farms that were over there that had unfree people who escaped to Detroit initially, till the British passed their anti-slavery laws in 1833, and then the flow reversed. Now people coming out of Missouri, coming out of Tennessee, Kentucky, are now coming up to Detroit because it's a real easy step to get over to Windsor. So that was something we've been doing for a long time. As far as the prohibition of alcohol, we as a state have been trying to do this almost since the beginning. We actually on and off have had prohibition in Michigan before the Civil War. And then it became a national movement after that. If you go back to the records in the legislature in Lansing, they're constantly having proposals to outlaw alcohol in Michigan. Hiram Walker wasn't a Canadian. Hiram Walker was a Detroiter. He knew full well that one of these days they were going to shut down the alcohol sales in Michigan, so he built his distillery across the river. And Canadian Club, they finally took that wonderful sign down, that beautiful neon sign that was up for years, was great. But then in 1917, actually I think the law went through in 16, went into effect in 17, we actually had prohibition in Michigan. Alcohol was outlawed, very popular out in the hinterland, in the rural areas, and this is pretty much the case all the way through Prohibition. Not so popular in Detroit, absolutely not. I mean, if we go over the people who lived here, starting with the French and the Irish and the British and the Germans and the Italians, and just keep going, they all have a history with some form of alcohol, be it beer or liquor or ouzo or pick your poison, but Detroiters did not think this was a good idea, and they never bought into Prohibition at all. It was overturned on a technicality in 1918, but by that time, we had figured out how to smuggle booze up from Ohio, okay? And it basically came up the Dixie Highway, okay? People figured out how to adjust their cars, put in false bottoms, put children on top of cases of beer, anything you could do to get the booze out of Ohio and up to Michigan. We had already started that process by the time Congress passed the 18th Amendment in 1919, and then the Volstead Act was actually the enforcement agent for that. Oddly enough, Congress figured that nationwide prohibition was going to be just accepted with open arms. Everybody was going to think this is a wonderful thing, get us back on the road to cleanliness and godliness and all of that, and they were wrong. They didn't put any money into enforcement for a very long time, and it wasn't until 1927 that they were convinced that they really had to if they wanted to shut it down, especially in the areas of Buffalo, Detroit, northern New York State. They had to put in some money for enforcement, and by that time people were getting the idea it was a bad idea, and they eventually rescinded it in 1933. How did we get there? There were all kinds of arguments in favor of prohibition. It was a matter of, keeping the young men out of saloons. There were cartoons in the newspaper of, dad in a saloon all by himself, crashed out on a table with an empty bottle of whiskey tipped over, and a little kid coming in and pulling on his sleeve saying, "Daddy, come home for dinner." They were pulling at heartstrings. There was lots of that going on in the media. And on the other hand, there was Carrie Nation, okay? I didn't realize it. She had a manager. She had an advance man that would go around and identify the saloons that needed to be busted up, and that's what she'd do. She'd give a speech, she'd grab an axe, she'd go into a saloon, and she'd break the place up. So there was kind of the subtle version, and then there was the Carrie Nation version. That was on the one side. On the other side, there's George Gies here. George Gies was a restaurant owner, hotel owner, beer distributor, probably would have owned a party store if they had existed at the time. And lagers, there's one on the left, the mother who's breastfeeding. Lagers Amber Fluid Mild give health and strength to mom and child. Okay? Not bad. And on the other hand, you've got the kid sitting in his high chair having a beer. And I'm glad when everybody laughs, but we really have to go back and remember that this would not have been unusual. I grew up on the East Side, so I had a bunch of Italian and Polish friends, and it was not unusual when I'd go over to their house as a 10 or a 12-year-old to get a small glass of wine, okay, or a little bit of beer. Just a little bit, not enough to do anything. But that happened, and that happened up through the 1950s and 60s, if you're talking about me. So back in the 1880s, and I don't even want to go back to the 1700s because everybody was drinking. The water was terrible, okay? So we just had this tradition going on, and from the German side, the Irish side, this is what you're looking at. If you were from more the English, Scottish, more temperance side, this is what you were looking at. So those were the competing factions in this war. In overall Prohibition, there were a couple of things we'll discuss. The Canadian factor, and we'll touch on that in a minute. There were exceptions. Alcohol was made in Michigan. It was made all over the country, in fact, during Prohibition. There was alcohol necessary for manufacturing processes. That was made all the time. Industrial alcohol continued to be made. You could make wine if you really wanted to. You could make up to, I think, about 10 gallons of wine yourself. And people did. A buddy of mine still got the grapevines in his backyard and is still making wine from the vines that were there. And then there was sacramental wines. And those kind of things were always available. And, of course, medicinal wine. There was medicinal wine. You could get liquors and things like that with medicine, but you had to get a prescription. It's kind of like pot today. Unintended consequences, the convention business was huge, through the roof. All the hotels, if you think about it, the Tuller, the Statler, the Book Cadillac, the Pickford Shelby, the Leland, all of those hotels went up in the 20s. Those were the hotels that anchored downtown. And, you know, we had a convention center back then. We had an armory downtown where all of these things were going on. Auto shows were getting started at this time, really kicking in. So conventions were huge. Corruption, also huge. We'll touch on that as we go down the way. And then crime. This is really when La Cosa Nostra got their talons into Detroit, and it really wasn't until just a few years ago, a dozen years ago, that we finally got those talons out. So this is an important part of the story. The Canadian factor. World War I, personal alcohol was not allowed. Of course, it existed. We know it existed, but all of the alcohol was supposed to go for the industrial uses, and it wasn't until after the war that the Parliament in Ontario, well, I'm sorry, in Ottawa, said, we're going to let each of the provinces decide what they want. And of course, Quebec said, well, no laws. Everything's legal. You can, and in fact, we'll sell it to anybody who wants. In Ontario, they closed the saloons. You could have liquor and beer for personal use in your home, and you were expected to order it from the folks in Quebec and have it delivered. Grandmothers were getting very large shipments from Quebec. That was kind of the way it went. They didn't tell, oddly enough, the production of liquor continued. So that Hiram Walker never went out of business. There were about 5 distilleries along the Detroit River, 8 breweries along the Detroit River. These were constantly in operation, but they couldn't sell to Canadians. Weird, huh? So who do they sell to? They sell to the people across the border. And oddly enough, they sell to themselves. A lot of the rum runners that left looking like they were heading for America would turn around, head downriver, and go right back into Canada because it was cheaper than buying from Quebec. So there was smuggling actually going on in and out of Canada at the same time. And the guys, the authorities really didn't care because the duties that were being charged, the excise duties, as long as you paid your excise duties and had the paperwork filled out, they didn't care. Okay? They'd take the money. Ontario coffers were getting rich, and that was fine. It wasn't until 1927 or 24 that they said, all right, we'll notify the authorities in the U.S. if we know that there's a shipment of liquor going over there. Of course, by the time the guy took the duties, walked up to his office, made the phone call across the river, notified those guys as to where it was, just that it was coming, and then they could send out the troops to find it. That liquor was already landed and on its way to a speakeasy. So that didn't really help the situation. In 1927, they realized the no saloon law was stupid, and so they rescinded that, and then they finally closed the export docks right toward the end, with the caveat that you couldn't export to the United States. So if you told the export agent, as he's standing there taking your now double duty, they doubled the duties, the excise tax, that you're going to Cuba or Mexico, That's what he'd write on the form, and he didn't care. And if he saw you in church the next morning, he wouldn't even ask about Cuba, okay? It really was, the Canadians were not interested in making this work for us because it was very good for them. I mentioned the fact that we had the fastest speedboats in the world, right? And we did. I mean, we raced them on the Detroit River. We won the Gold Cup in 1915, raced it first in Detroit in 1916, and we've been racing on the river ever since. And we've had the fastest boats. England, Italy, people would send boats over to challenge us, Canada. We always had the fastest boats. So having that made it real tough. Not only that, but I grew up on the east side, and there is a train track that runs right along the shoreline. So you could pull the fast boats up to the dock, and up to the railroad car and just load right in there. So by the time anybody saw you, you turn on your engine, you blast across, and here's kind of the neat part. This is the north side, north of the Belle Isle Bridge. Whereas we look at the shoreline today, and it's all either concrete shoreline, steel seawall, or riprap. That wasn't the case back then. There were all kinds of little cubbies that you could get into, and especially, and I know this is kind of the case downriver, but on the east side, just south of the Lake St. Clair there at Windmill Point, there's kind of a little Venice carved in there. If anybody's been over there, there are canals that go for blocks up to Jefferson and down from Alta Road toward Detroit. So that if you left from that train car, turned on your engine, you could be across the river in 5 minutes, into a canal, into a boathouse, door down, you're done. So by the time the cops heard your engine and got headed in your direction, you're turning the engine off and you're quiet. Okay, so that was really, Detroit was a perfect spot for doing what they wanted to do. And this happened all up and down I grew up on the east side, so I don't know the south side, but, E-Course was notorious. The mayor was in on it. St. Clair Shores up on Lake St. Clair was huge. I mean, they built a big building called Blossom Heath so that people could have parties there. The police had parties there. It was what people were doing. They flatly ignored it. This is the police depot. Actually, part of the problem was nobody was sure who the police were. Within the police department, there was Detroit cops. There were all the E-Course police, the St. Clair Shores, Grosse Pointe cops. There was the Michigan State Police. There was Customs. There was Border Patrol at that point. There was the Revenue Service was involved. Nobody was quite sure who was in charge, and nobody was talking to each other. So they were kind of all acting independently. This is down, I believe, at the foot of Orleans, and these are the boats that the police had. And if you notice one thing about those boats, every single one of them's different. These are captured rum runners. So the cops are working with last year's boats, while the rum runners are making a fortune and buying the brand new boats with the bigger engines. Okay? Not only that, this gets better. One of the things the rum runners did is they had barges. They'd buy old boats, take everything out of them, and just fill them with booze. And they'd pull those across the river. And if they thought they were getting chased, they just cut the cord, let it go. Sometimes, well, I could go on. Anyway, so they'd catch this boat. They'd take this boat and dump all the booze off the side into the river, right off their boatyard there at Orleans. In fact, kids would go out after dark and dive for the stuff and bring it up. Coleman Young writes about that in his autobiography. It helped pay the food bills for the families. The kids would dive, get the stuff, take it to the speakeasy, sell it there. They eventually started breaking the booze before they dropped it to the bottom. But if they'd bring these barges back and they would auction them off. So who do you think is standing there at the auction buying the barges? All right. Yeah, of course. Absolutely. So they were really, it was just this kind of this revolving door of vessels that could be had for almost nothing and could make a big living. I mean, 2 or 3 trips and you would have paid for your boat and probably your house. The police really tried to do something. And in fact, Detroit had the first radio dispatched police car. The idea it was only a dispatch. It wasn't a talkback. There was the receiver would be in the car, And these guys would wait for word to come from a transmitter that was in the third story, the attic of the Belle Isle police station. Okay, in fact, there's a marker up in front of that confirms this. But there were a couple of problems with this working out. One is if they got a word that there was a shipment coming into the foot of Riopelle, chances are it was coming into the foot of Joseph Campo. Okay, bad news there. But there was also this problem. The guy who ran the Belle Isle police station was on the take from the smugglers. So the guy who owned the radio, the guy who ran the radio, was in on the game, okay? Finally got arrested and busted. And there's actually, that story's got a couple of other instances of things happening. And people were getting really frustrated because there are pictures, I think the Detroit News published pictures of shipments coming into the dock a block from the revenuers. You know, that where I showed all those boats, next block down, they're landing booze and the cops can't get to it fast enough. So that really they're starting to get some bad PR from this. They're under the gun and behind the eight ball from the get-go. Not enough money, not enough coordination, and everybody thought it was going to be embraced, and it wasn't. Of course, during the winter, things got easier, unless you're this guy. The lakes froze much more than they do today at that point. And it was real easy to drive across Lake St. Clair. There's some great aerial pictures of basically a highway that would run from Amherstburg across either around Boblo or down the bottom of Gros Isle to get to Trenton. And they'd just follow each other's tracks. I mean, they could do it at night because you'd see the tracks. It'd be like a two-lane road across the river. And every once in a while, something like this would happen. In fact, I've been told by the police divers that there's a Mack truck on the bottom of the river, just downriver from the Dawson Museum. It was full of beer at one time. The police divers have been using it kind of as a graduation exercise for the last 30 years. So for the last thing you got to do is go down and find the truck and bring up a bottle of beer. So we know this happened. We know they're down there. Cops tried to fix this. This is a Grosse Pointe Farms cop out in a ice boat trying to chase him. Now, he could do about 60 knots. Okay, he can go really, really fast. But if he's not careful, he's either going to tip it over. He certainly would not be able to pull out his gun and shoot accurately. And frankly, he's kind of a sitting duck to anybody who's got a gun in the car he's trying to chase. So they tried. They were really kind of up against it. On top of that, we had ferries that went back and forth between Detroit and Windsor every 5 or 10 minutes. You could drive your car on, just like when they were smuggling up from Ohio, or you could just walk on. And people, a lot of Detroiters worked in Windsor. A lot of Windsorite worked in Detroit. Of course, the borders are a whole lot different than they are today. And it wasn't hard to just pick up what you needed and carry it back for a day or a week, whatever you needed. The woman on the left is bootlegging. That's what that is. And if you were to buy, now I haven't bought one of those little pint bottles in a while, but they always had a convex side to them. So they fit in your back pocket or they could fit in your boot. One woman's using the water bottle trick, and then the woman down on the far end has got these two huge canisters on her, and just throw a loose coat over it, and you walk on and off the ferry, and you're done. And of course, we built them a bridge and a tunnel right in the middle of it. Okay, and we had these railroad ferries going back and forth. Load up one car out of the 24 with booze and get it through. Somebody made a fortune. I mean, it was real. And every half hour, 3 or 4 of these ferries were going back and forth. So, and then there was the creativity mode. And this is really where it gets fun. This was a torpedo that was towed back and forth. They'd load it with a couple of cases of whatever it was. They had a cable that ran across the bottom of the riverbed. They'd hook it up and they'd just wind the sucker across the river. There was one of these up by Alta Road in Grosse Pointe, and there was another one down on Gros Isle. This we know happened. There was talk of somebody actually putting in a pipeline. That's never been proven. Nobody's ever found a pipeline. But Christmas trees coming down from Canada, they'd be all bundled up, right, with bottles of booze stuck in the branches. Oftentimes, fishermen, if they were interested in doing this, they could suspend a net full of liquor under their boat. And if they thought they were going to get caught, they could just cut it off. And what they did is they had a float that was attached, had a little flag that would pop up, but the float would be held down by some salt, like a salt lick type thing. And as the salt dissolved, A couple of days later, the float pops up and they can go back and recover their booze. We are a creative people. Okay, there's no end of stories of the fun that was going on to get this done, and that's the good side of it. People started to realize this is pretty hopeless. This was a newspaper cartoon. You know, how's the flood going down? It's going down just great. You know, at 2,500 cases a day. It's estimated that of all the liquor that went from Canada into the United States, 70% of it came in through the Detroit corridor. And of that 70%, the police were able to stop 5%. So you can imagine the flow that was coming in. And frankly, Detroiters really didn't seem to care. Of course, I mentioned home brewing. The production of beer is up huge. The legal wine is being produced as much as it can. And alcohol production, curiously enough, especially once the Great Depression kicked in and we stopped making cars, but we're still making industrial alcohol at 400% the amount we were making earlier. We know some of that was going bad, and some of it was going bad. Some of that alcohol was killing people, which is partly why the Canadians rescinded their no saloon law, because Canadians were dying too. I mean, they were making bad hooch in Canada and sending it over, and if some of it went back, they realized they were killing their own people. But some of that industrial alcohol was pretty bad stuff, and people were dying because of that. Stroh's, of course, we know that during the Prohibition time, they stopped making beer. Everybody has heard the story that they survived by making ice cream, right? Well, they also would sell you anything you needed to make beer. They kept, the brewery always had the hops, the barleys, whatever they needed, the yeasts on hand, so that they could go back into production as soon as they needed to. And while they kept that stuff fresh, they'd sell it to you. You can go home and make your own. That's not their business, but they did a fairly good business doing that. Speakeasies were everywhere, literally everywhere. They were in all the tall buildings downtown, had 2 or 3 of them. So if in the middle of the day you needed to get a shot, you went up to the 23rd floor, you knew which door to knock on. They were in funeral homes, they were in flower shops. I've had a lot of people come up after talks and say, my grandmother ran a bar in the basement of our house. It was the only way they survived the Depression. And it really was. It was a way of bringing money in. A buddy of mine's uncle tuned up Model Ts for running across during the winter. I mean, that's how people got money in. There were also, they'd fly planes over, but planes couldn't carry much, so that wasn't really much of a viable way. But the speakeasies just kept growing and growing, and in fact, this is my favorite quote. It was absolutely impossible to get a drink in Detroit unless you walked at least 10 feet, told the busy bartender what you wanted in a voice loud enough for him to hear you above the uproar, okay? Malcolm Bingay, who I'm not sure, he wasn't for a newspaper guy, he wasn't a heavy drinker. Okay, so he was speaking pretty humorously and pretty soberly about the ability to get a drink in Detroit. It wasn't a place where Prohibition ever happened. The growth of organized crime was pretty natural. There was money to be made. And for the people who really didn't care how they did it, it got uglier and it got uglier. The Oakland Sugar House Gang was up on Oakland Street in Highland Park, and they basically taught the guys of the Purple Gang. And everybody's heard of the Purple Gang. The Purple started out as just teenage thugs. You know, rolling drunks, stealing, ladies' bus money. Eventually, they got into the protection racket. You know, they were trying to get money out of all the merchants up and down Hastings Street back when it was a Jewish neighborhood before it became a black neighborhood. And they got really blatant, and a lot of people have come up and say, my uncle used to work for the Purple Gang. Everybody worked for the Purple Gang. They had a way of doing it, and they were blatant, and arguably they were kind of smart and kind of stupid. They would shoot people in daylight just because that was intimidating. They didn't bother renting or buying any boats. They'd waited till you landed the boats and you put it on the truck, and then they stole the truck. Okay, that just made life a whole lot easier for them. Eventually, about half of them ended up dead and half of them ended up in prison, and that was only about halfway through Prohibition. They had a good ride yet to go had they been a little easier on it, and the Italian families were really happy to see them go away. And basically the Licavolis, but you know, most of these people, in fact, I know some Zerillis and Vitalis, they, you know, all of this stuff was part of the family lore, and they really got into the business, and it was heavy duty. There were also, every neighborhood, and Detroit, remember, was a city of neighborhoods. There was the Russian neighborhood, the Hungarian neighborhood, the Irish neighborhoods, and all of these neighborhoods had their own little gangs, who very often were either working with the Purples or working with the Italians, and it made it work. It was its own little empire, its own little economy, and frankly, it was a big economy. It was the second biggest economy in the city, next to the auto business, especially when the Depression hit. Here's the Purples, and I'm judging by this picture, they're not very happy. I'm thinking this is a police photo. Here's a picture of the Zerillis. They're okay. They're having a good time. They've figured out a way to do it and how to stay out of prison, and they really did. And the mafia, this is really what got the mafia going in Detroit. $215 million industry at the time. It was huge. It had justified, the profits were immediate. I mean, it was all cash, and it justified the fast cars, the payola. Because of the conventions, prostitution and gambling came along with it. So really, this is where things started to get ugly. The gunplay was more obvious. The prostitutes were on all kinds of different neighborhoods, and it really, the people who cared, even if they liked a drink, didn't like the way Detroit was going. Eventually, we did have the out-of-town guys come in too. The Al Capones, the Giordanos from New Jersey, started seeing big money here, and they started moving in and actually taking over where the big guys were running. Law enforcement suffered pretty badly. Hamtramck and E-Course, those things are well recorded, but 34,000 police officers arrested in one form or another for assisting, and they may have been taking payola, they may have actually been moving the booze, they may have merely been looking the other way, but that was the number of people that they were arresting over time. Only 8,000, well, almost 9,000 were convicted, but that's a small number. The Coast Guardsmen, I mean, these are the guys that are coming from Iowa and New Jersey to, you know, be on the boats. They don't even know anybody, and they're getting cited locally for helping out. And then the drunkenness. I think I figured this is like 6 drunks a day over a 10-year period. So the public drunkenness was starting to bother people. And then there were the dead people on the street. The shootings really did start to get out of hand, and that was bothering people. Then Jerry Buckley got shot, and Jerry Buckley was the J.P. McCarthy of his day. Radio broadcaster, broadcasted out of the LaSalle Hotel, eventually became the Detroiter Hotel. They had a studio there, and he, arguably, people say he may have had ties to the underworld. But at some point, he started railing against the mafia and railing against organized crime. And 3 guys walked into his hotel after his broadcast. He was sitting there reading the paper in the lobby, and they just shot him. You know, one guy sitting in the car. They all got into the car and left. There were witnesses. Plenty of people saw it. Huge funeral. 150,000 people came to his funeral. But nobody fingered the shooters. Okay, so this is really starting to turn things, and then the real straw that broke the camel's back. A rum runner was getting chased by some revenuers one day, and he saw the St. Clair coming up the Detroit River, and he decided this would make a great duck blind kind of thing. So he started ducking around the backside of the boat to get away from the revenuers, and the 2 of them are cutting around the boat as this boat full of people is coming up from Boblo, and the revenuers start shooting. And they eventually hit somebody on the boat. They don't kill them, they injure them. But the fact that the police are starting to hurt people really gets attention. And then there's things like this. This is, you know, we're trampling on constitutional rights. Sailors, duck hunters, fishermen are getting constantly harassed out there just as being boaters. And some of it may have been justifiable, but most of it probably was not. And you get boarded several times, and you're not happy with the police force anymore, and this was kind of changing the way things went. And the word on the street throughout the nation was that Detroit had really become the Wild West town. You wanted a nuts time, you wanted to really Las Vegas it up, you went to Detroit because they had everything you needed. Drugs, liquor, women, gambling. Detroit had it. And, you know, this kind of shows that the cops were on the take, the cops were in the bars, the women are on the corners, taxi dancers available everywhere. The reputation of the city started to change. And the city leaders, many of whom were big backers, the Alger family were big backers of Prohibition. And the Alger family looked at this and said, this isn't working. And so actually Mrs. Alger was behind this, the Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, and they start using some of the same arguments for repealing the law that were used to put the law into place. It's for the children. We need to stop this for the kids, all right? Complete switch around. And all of a sudden, the people who supported it no longer supported it, and that eventually caused the law to be repealed in 1933. Now, it was supposed to be repealed. It was supposed to change over the first day, January 1st at midnight in 34. You were supposed to be able to buy liquor like you could before Prohibition. But in Michigan, we started handing out vouchers that went around that, dispensations for that kind of thing. This is back in May, not long after the law has been passed, and the American Legion comes to town, and the Legionnaires, Mr. Stroh is happy to get things going as quickly as possible. In 8 hours, the Legionnaires drank up 300 half barrels and 500 cases of beer. When I said Stroh's was ready to go, they were ready to go. And so was everybody else. Pfeiffer and E&B and all the other breweries, wonderful breweries we had in Detroit, were ready to take off and make this happen. And they did. I mean, we turned it around pretty fast. Now, the one thing I always like to mention is that while this was, the best of times, the worst of times, the 1920s was a pretty weird time. Detroit's growing incredibly fast. We have a lot of new immigrants coming in, first from Europe, and then 1924, we changed the law, the national law, and immigration essentially stops so that the auto companies are going down south to recruit. They're bringing whites and blacks up who come with some great music, some great barbecue, and some real baggage racially. Okay, and that's all coming into Detroit, flooding into a boom town, and that really caused some tough times. And there was poverty in Detroit despite the good times, and we had a number of organizations get started to counteract that. Now, the Masons have been in Detroit since very early. The British brought the Masons in a long time ago, but we started the National Exchange Club, we started the Goodfellows, Old Newsboys, and we started the Kiwanis. Were all started in Detroit to help people out of problems, people who had issues, either around Christmas time or normally, but to do good work, they did this kind of thing. And at this point in the 1920s, Detroit was hugely Catholic, either Roman Catholic or Orthodox Catholic. We had a lot of Serbians come in, a lot of Greeks, a lot of Russians. There was quite an Eastern Orthodox thing here. So we had the Knights of Columbus, the Knights of St. John, and the Knights of Malta were all here again, doing good work in the city. Problem was, we also had the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan and the Black Legion. And most people don't know that the Klan, this is north of Tennessee, this was the home of the Klan. They used to have marches up and down Woodward of 20,000 people. They burned crosses on the front of the city hall and the courthouse. The Klan had moved in when bringing the Southern folk up, and especially in a relatively unstable social environment that Detroit was as a boomtown, the Klan took real solid hold. The Black Legion started in Cleveland and arguably is kind of the poor cousin of the Klan. A little more brutal, but they didn't last as long. So Detroit was a tough town. This, it wasn't all great architecture. It wasn't all fun parties and booze. People were getting killed and people were getting intimidated. It was a tough thing. And these are, actually, I'm going to go right through these because these are kind of eye charts that are available if you want them. There's the great book called Working Detroit, and it talks about the change in the population between 1910 and 1930 was really quite stark. But all of this had a lot to do with creating the city that we've got today. We kind of have been moving away from our maritime heritage. And back in the 20s, 100 years ago, everybody in Detroit knew somebody or had a boat, and lots of people were out fishing. They were spending time on Belle Isle watching boats go by. We had a lot closer affinity with our maritime. But it was during the 20s that most of those buildings went up. Short of the Rensen and the city-county building and the gas building and some of the new skyscrapers. That's the 20s is when a lot of our really beautiful, iconic architecture happened. It's when we really established Detroit as Motor City, as a first class. I mean, at some point there, our population rose from about 13th up to about 6th in the country, and we really became the powerhouse that then went on to create the arsenal of democracy that then went on to create all the wonderful cars that we did in the 50s and 60s and on from that. But the Roaring 20s was an incredible time in the city of Detroit. There are some great books out on it. Phil Mason wrote one called Rum-running in the Roaring 20s. It's as easy as that. If you see it at the local library, it's a great read. Wonderful professor, wonderful historian, but he wrote it for people like us. It's real easy to read, got some great photos in, and a lot of funny stories because it was an incredibly unusual time in Detroit. Thank you. If anybody had any questions, I will try to answer them or make something up.
How involved was Al Capone with the Detroit mob during Prohibition?
As I understand it, he worked with the Licavoli family. And the Licavolis were the group responsible for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So he was arguably really involved. I don't know that he came here but a few times, but he spent a lot of time in Michigan. He spent a lot of time up north of Bay City, on the north side of the Saginaw Bay there. He had a place further up north. There were a lot of places that he visited. How often he came to Detroit, I don't know. But very involved. That's where all his log cabin came from. So, yes, sir.
Why don't you talk about J.L. Hudson, the biggest department store under one roof, I believe, in the world.
It was. It wasn't actually in the 20s, though, and it was the second largest. Harrods in London was bigger. 'Cause I always said the same thing. I always said the largest one. It was the tallest one, and I always said the largest one, but I had a very good friend who's really good at retail in Detroit tell me that it was the second. But it was a huge building. In the 20s, he owned about half that block, and by the time the 20s was over, he had owned the rest of it. Newcomb Endicott. Anybody remember Newcomb Endicott? Nope. They were the J.L. Hudsons before J.L. Hudson's. And Hudson's essentially bought out their building, knocked it down, and put up the rest of his. And then, yeah, so by the end of the 20s, he was just an incredibly large and really good guy. As far as I can tell, he was really good to his employees, and of course, he's the guy responsible for the Thanksgiving Day Parade. I think 1924. So that would have gotten started during this period. And at one point, it was all employees that were in that parade. They pulled the floats, they put on the clown costumes, did it all themselves. So quite an institution in this town. And his grandson is still around. Joseph Hudson Jr. is still quite a philanthropist in this area. You were next. Yes, sir.
I don't have a question. I just have a comment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Absolutely a fantastic program.
Oh, that you can say.
You did a great job, and I like your style, just the way you presented this thing. Hey, excellent job.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. It's pretty easy when it's this fun. Yes, sir. I don't know. I've been asked that before. The question was, is the Bernstein family that you hear on every Tigers game, are they connected with the Bernsteins who were the Purple Gang? And I can't answer that. I don't know. I'm assuming that name would be like mine, like Stone. There are a lot of Stones around, so the chances of us being related was probably not there. Yes, sir.
Purple Gang. Where'd the purple come from? How'd they get the name?
It's come down to us that two people who had just gotten frisked for their payment money As the guys were leaving, one of the guys commented, "Those guys are like bad meat, purple." Which we don't see that kind of meat anymore, but if you've ever seen it, bad meat is purple. So, yes, sir.
I think I saw a thing on PBS one time about an area called Paradise Valley. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about that?
Sure. Paradise Valley was a northern extension of a southern area known as Black Bottom. And Black Bottom was arguably the oldest neighborhood in Detroit. Initially settled by Irish, who then got kind of kicked out by the Germans who came in after them. The Irish went over to Corktown, and the Germans really populated and built that area prior to the Civil War, and then as they could afford to, they moved kind of north. St. Joe's and St. Mary's were built as German churches in that neighborhood, and eventually the Germans kind of moved up Gratiot. Assumption Grotto was a German church. The Deutsches Haus on Mack Avenue was part of that. As the Germans moved out, the next group moved in, which in this case was Italian, and after they moved out, then there was kind of a Middle Eastern flavor that came in. Middle Eastern and Eastern European came in. So you started getting the Slavs, and you had the Greeks that were moving in, hence Greektown. And as they became richer and moved on, then it was replaced by African Americans. And by the time we got World War II, it was the only place that African Americans, well, there were a couple of little enclaves in other places, but it was where the majority of African Americans lived in the city, about 7% of the population and 1% of the footprint. And at that point, the housing stock is 80 or 100 years old. So really, it was the people I know that lived there. It was a wonderfully warm knit, very closely knit community. All the black doctors, the black dentists, black shop owners were all there along Hastings Street. And it had been a Jewish neighborhood, part of the Eastern, and as that neighborhood grew, just by the very population that was there, they kind of spread up Hastings Street, spread up John R., about as far as like where Orchestra Hall is, maybe as far as Warren. Right across from Orchestra Hall was the Gotham Hotel, which was the black-owned hotel in town. The Flame Show Bar was on John R., the 666 Horseshoe Lounge. A lot of the great jazz clubs or show clubs were in that neighborhood called Paradise Valley, which was north of the Black Bottom. So the Black Bottom was kind of a business area. The Paradise Valley was more of an entertainment area, and really, really lively. It's where some of the first places where blacks and whites got together in bars and show bars. That's where Della Reese got her start, was at the Flame Show Bar. Jackie Wilson, and that's where all of the black entertainers came. Whether they played at the Book Cadillac for a wedding, they had to stay at the Gotham Hotel. And if they were on their way to the Gotham, they'd stop in any one of the bars or clubs to play. So the Ella Fitzgeralds, the Duke Ellingtons, those are the kind of people who are in the Paradise Valley area. So, yes, sir.
I just finished reading the new book from the Detroit Free Press, Detroit Memories.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Nice pictures.
And in pages 48 and 49, there's a full-page spread of 100,000 people at Navin Field protesting the state's attempt at passing an amendment to ban private and parochial schools in 1920. Ever hear about that?
No. Wow.
Curious what that was all about.
I'm going to shoot. That's why I hate coming out here. Now I got to go look that up. That would be really tough because, boy, the public schools in Detroit were very, very good, which is why we had some of those great bands. They had wonderful music programs, good athletic programs, and also wonderful technical programs. But the parochial schools were where a lot of people sent their kids. That was part of the problem, part of the collapse that happened in the 50s and 60s is the parochial schools went out of business. That support wasn't there. And Detroit being so Catholic, I'd be surprised if they tried to pass that. But it sounds like they did. Now I got to go look it up. So, interesting. Crazy.
Yeah, the 20s is when radio came in.
Yeah.
The big radio stations. I'm sure WJR was probably around then, but what were...
Well, WWJ argues with a station in Dayton as to who was actually the first commercial radio station. The Dayton station, I believe, went on with a license first, whereas WWJ went on, they were M8K. They had a different call letters. But they went on with regular programming without their license, figuring if they could just get started, they'd eventually, William Scripps was behind it. He had enough money, he figured he would eventually get a license. So the two of them argue about it. But so WWJ is really early, and actually we've got their transmitter that they did their first transmission on. It's down in our Gallery of Culture. You can actually see it. It's something like you could have built out of, as kids, we built from Radio Shack stuff. Pretty impressive stuff going on. And there was a guy named Thomas Clark, who was behind a lot of the radio advancements that went on as far as radio telegraphy between the ships on the Great Lakes. He actually did the first ship-to-shore radio transmissions on the Great Lakes. And so we had some really, really innovative people in Detroit besides the WWJs. The WJR came along a little bit after that, and there were 3 or 4 pretty soon after that. So, and that did make a big difference, as with the Jerry Buckley thing. I mean, and with Father Coughlin, I don't know if any of you followed that, but Father Coughlin came in and just became a radio superstar out of that period. So it's an important part of the culture. I should probably add that. Yes, sir.
Speaking of radio, did not the Lone Ranger program originate in Detroit?
Lone Ranger, Sergeant Preston of the Yukon, and the Green Hornet. All started in Detroit out of the Maccabees building. They had studios way, way up on the top floors. The studios are actually still there and intact. WDET used them up until about 10 or 15 years ago, but they basically just locked the door. I've seen them. They're pretty much as they were back then, which is pretty cool. There's people that keep trying to make a museum out of it, and it just doesn't happen. Museums take money. That's a tough thing. Yes, sir.
Just as a matter of interest, my dad was born in the early teens and raised in East Toledo. When he was 11 years old, him and his buddy used to jump the train, and the old coal runners weren't too fast back then.
Yep.
So they'd be riding the train for a while, started out on the other side of the Ottawa River coming north, and they decided they better get off and figure out how to get home, right? They got off in Luna Pier and discovered the canals in Luna Pier. So they wanted, boys being boys, they wandered around the canals, and this fellow had a shiny mahogany crisscross sitting there and said, "Boys, you want to see a boat? We'll go for a boat ride."
I can see where this is going.
I'll leave a lot of that out, but yeah, the boys finally decided it was okay. The guy said, "I'll give you $2 a piece if you go for a boat ride."
Which was huge money.
Huge money.
Huge money. Yep.
This is 1925. The boat stopped. Next stop was Amherstburg. They were there for 20 minutes. Left Amherstburg with 5 inches of freeboard. Come back. The whole idea of taking these boys on that boat ride was when they got back to the canal, if there was a federal man standing there wanting to inspect that boat, he could not board the boat because there was a miner on board. It's ready to go up. I'm not getting paid no more. And he was off on his way to the bar, and the boys get off the boat, truck show up. Boat come back up out of water, and the guy said, "If it's nice weather tomorrow and you guys want to make some money, come on back." Did that all summer long.
That was big money, and especially, well, even 25 things are pretty good, but by 30 things were not very good. So it really did help a lot of families get through the Depression. So yeah, we'll do one more.
I heard that radio station story before. I'm originally from Pittsburgh.
Okay.
And they claim that they were the first commercial radio station. And WJR here in Detroit claims they were the first commercial radio.
WWJ, yeah. And frankly, you know, all of them, and I've learned this in the history business, all of them have a caveat that comes after it. First commercial radio station with a license. First commercial radio station to hit the air. And maybe Pittsburgh hit the air first, but they didn't have regularly scheduled programming. DSO was the first symphony orchestra to be broadcast on the national airwaves. So that one I'm sure is right, with no caveat. So, but there's always a caveat. There's the mile of Woodward that's the first paved highway in the country. Ohio had a mile of pavement down a year before that, but it wasn't a highway. Okay, so you got to make sure if you say that, you got to say the first highway, and it's always a caveat. So I really appreciate you having me, and I hope to see you again in February.